Grab a cup of coffee or tea, sit back, and let yourself get swept up in the story. Subscribe and leave a comment. The 1970s did not open with a single dramatic moment for American women. There was no one morning when everything changed. Instead, the decade unfolded as a slow, uneven, often contested shift in what it meant to be a woman in the United States, a shift that had been building for years and would keep building long after the decade ended. It was a period when a woman's life could still look, on the surface, much like her mother's: marriage, children, a home to run. But underneath that familiar surface, the legal, economic, and cultural ground. At the start of the decade, a woman in most states still needed her husband's signature to open a credit card in her own name. She could be legally fired for becoming pregnant in many workplaces. Help-wanted advertisements in newspapers were still routinely divided into columns for men and columns for women, steering job seekers by gender before they had even applied. By the end of the decade, none of that was true in the same way. Not because change arrived all at once, but because a series of court rulings, new federal laws, and a rising, organized movement had, year by year, redrawn the boundaries of what women were legally and economically permitted to do. This is the story of how that decade actually looked and felt, told through the ordinary details of daily life. The workplace, the courtroom, the living room. It is not a story of women uniformly marching in one direction. Millions of American women in the 1970s lived lives shaped by feminism, whether they identified with the movement or not, and millions of others lived lives that felt largely untouched by it, still centered on home and family in ways that had defined earlier generations. Both of those experiences were real, often within the very same neighborhood, and sometimes within the very same household. Chapter 2: The kitchen at the center of the house. For a large share of American women in the 1970s, daily life still revolved heavily around the home, and the home still revolved heavily around the kitchen. Despite the rising number of women entering paid work, over the course of the decade, the majority of American households in the early 1970s still had a wife who did not work outside the home. And even in households where she did, the kitchen remained her primary domain of daily labor. In most families, a division of household work that surveys of the period consistently document. The kitchen itself had changed considerably from earlier decades, shaped by the post-war boom in home appliances. Electric ranges, refrigerators, and increasingly dishwashers had become standard in a growing share of American homes by the 1970s. Though still far from universal, particularly among lower income and rural households, processed and convenience foods, from frozen dinners to instant mixes, had expanded rapidly through the 1960s and continued to shape how meals were prepared, offering time savings that mattered enormously to women managing housework, paid employment outside it. Cookbooks and women's magazines of the decade reflect this tension directly. Publications like Better Homes and Gardens and Good Housekeeping continued to run recipes and household tips aimed at the full-time homemaker, while also beginning to run articles addressing the working mother, offering shortcuts and time management advice for women juggling both roles. This dual audience was not a contradiction so much as an accurate reflection of the decade itself. A period in which the traditional homemaker and the newly working mother were not two separate generations, but often two versions of the very same woman, adjusting her life year by year as circumstances and opportunities shifted around her. Chapter 3: The Pill and the Politics of the Body. Few single developments shaped American women's lives in the 1970s as profoundly as expanded access to reliable birth control, and in 1973, the Supreme Court's ruling in Roe v. Wade, which established a constitutional right to abortion nationwide. The birth control pill itself had been approved by the Food and Drug Administration back in 1960. But throughout the 1960s, its availability had been restricted in various ways, particularly unmarried women in many states. It was not until the Supreme Court's 1972 ruling in Eisenstadt versus Sperrett that unmarried individuals across the country gained the same legal right to contraception that married couples already held. The practical effect of this legal and medical shift was significant. Historians and demographers have documented that expanded access to reliable contraception in this period was associated with women delaying marriage, pursuing more years of education, and entering professional and graduate programs in numbers that would have been far less feasible under earlier. Reproductive constraints. This did not mean every woman used this new control in the same way, or that access was equal across the country, since state laws and local attitudes toward contraception and abortion still varied considerably even after the federal rulings. The 1973 Roe versus Wade decision itself became one of the most contested legal and cultural flashpoints of the decade, and that contest was not settled by the ruling, but rather began in earnest because of it. Organizations opposing legal abortion mobilized quickly in its aftermath, while women's rights organizations worked to defend and expand the ruling's protections. Running through the rest of the decade and far beyond it, placed questions about women's bodies and personal autonomy at the very center of American political life in a way that had not been true in previous decades. Chapter 4: Help wanted, divided by gender. Walk into a public library in the early 1970s and look at the classified section of nearly any major American newspaper, and you would find something that today seems startling. Job listings explicitly divided into a help wanted male column and a help wanted female column. Sorting available jobs by the gender of the applicant before a single qualification was even considered. This practice, common since long before the decade began, was technically illegal under Title V of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of sex. Yet it persisted in many newspapers well into early 1970s, enforced inconsistently at best. It took continued legal pressure, including a landmark 1973 Supreme ruling in Pittsburgh Press Company versus Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, to finally establish that sex-segregated job advertising violated anti-discrimination law and could be prohibited by local ordinances. Following that ruling and the broader enforcement pressure of the decade, gender-divided classified sections gradually disappeared from American newspapers over the following years. Behind these classified pages lay a workplace still structured around deep occupational segregation. Women in the early 1970s were heavily concentrated in a narrow band of occupations: teaching, nursing, clerical and secretarial work, and retail work, and retail sales made up an outsized share of paid employment available to women. Fields like law, medicine, engineering, and skilled trades remained overwhelmingly male, not primarily by explicit legal barrier by this point, but through a dense web of hiring practices, workplace culture, and social expectation that discouraged women from applying in the first place. The decades' ongoing legal battles over sex discrimination in hiring were, in large part, a fight to dismantle that dense, informal web rather than any single formal law. Chapter 5: Credit, Banking, and Financial Independence. One of the more surprising legal realities of the early 1970s, from a modern perspective, involved something as ordinary as a credit card. Throughout much of the decade, it remained common practice for banks and lenders to require a married woman to have her husband cousin for a credit card or loan in her own name, regardless of her own income or credit history. Unmarried, divorced, and widowed women often faced similar obstacles, sometimes required to have a male relative cousin applications even when they had stable income of their own. This changed with the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, signed into law in 1974 and 1974, which prohibited creditors from discriminating against applicants on the basis of sex or marital status. The law represented a direct legislative response to years of documented lending discrimination and gave American women, for the first time under federal law, a guaranteed individual right to establish credit in their own name without requiring a husband's or male relative's cosignature. The practical impact of this law extended well beyond the credit card itself. Financial independence of this kind touched a woman's ability to rent an apartment on her own, finance a car, or build the credit history necessary for a future mortgage, each of which had previously been complicated or blocked entirely for many women without male cosigners, for women leaving unhappy or abusive marriages, a category that would grow substantially over the course of the decade as divorce law also changed. The ability to establish independent credit was not an abstract legal victory, but a concrete, practical tool that shaped whether leaving a marriage was financially survivable at all. Chapter 6: No-Fault Divorce and the Changing Household. Divorce law underwent one of its most significant transformations in American history during the 1970s, with lasting effects on how women's domestic lives were structured. Before this period, most states required a spouse seeking divorce to prove fault, such as adultery or cruelty, in court, a legal process that could be slow, expensive, and often humiliating, and in practice made it especially difficult for women without independent income to leave a marriage. Regardless of its circumstances, California passed the nation's first no-fault divorce law in 1969, allowing couples to divorce simply on the grounds of irreconcilable differences, without needing to prove wrongdoing by either spouse. Over the course of the 1970s, the great majority of other states adopted similar no-fault divorce laws, fundamentally changing the legal landscape of marriage across the country. The divorce rate in the United States rose substantially through the decade, reaching a peak by the early 1980s that reflected both the new legal accessibility of divorce and broader shifts in social attitudes toward marriage as a lifelong, unbreakable institution. For many women, this legal shift intersected directly with the economic changes discussed earlier. A woman considering divorce in 1970 faced a starkly different set of practical obstacles than a woman considering the same decision in 1979, after the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the broader loosening of divorce law. This does not mean divorce became easy or without hardship, particularly for women without work experience outside the home, who often faced serious financial strain after a marriage ended. But the decade did mark the period in which the legal machinery of marriage and its dissolution shift meaningfully toward treating women as independent legal and economic actors rather than dependents whose consent or independent standing mattered less than their husbands. Chapter 7: The Equal Rights Amendment and the Fight that divided women. In March of 1972, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, a proposed addition to the United States Constitution stating simply that equality of rights under the law could not be denied or abridged on account of sex, and sent it to the states for ratification. For a brief period, momentum appeared strong, with a wave of states ratifying the amendment quickly in its first 2 years. But the amendment ultimately failed to secure ratification by the required number of states before its extended deadline passed in the early 1980s. And the fight over its passage became one of the most revealing conflicts of the decade regarding what equality actually meant to American women themselves. Opposition to the amendment was organized most prominently by activist Phyllis Schlafly, whose Stop ERA campaign argued that the amendment would strip away legal protections traditionally afforded to women, such as exemption from military draft registration and certain labor protections, offering, in her view, little practical benefit in exchange. Schlafly's campaign found real support among many American women, particularly those who felt the amendment reflected the priorities of professional, urban feminists rather than the concerns of homemakers and mothers whose lives centered on family rather than career advancement. The ERA debate, more than perhaps any other single controversy of the decade, revealed that American women were not a single political bloc, moving in one unified direction. Supporters of the amendment argued it was a necessary constitutional guarantee against future rollback of hard-won legal gains, while opponents argued that existing legislation, including the laws discussed in earlier chapters of this story, already provided meaningful protection without the risks they associated with a broad constitutional amendment. This genuine and often bitter disagreement among women themselves, playing out in state legislatures across the country throughout the decade, complicates any simple narrative of the 1970s as a single, unified march toward feminist consensus. Chapter 8, title IOX and a New Generation of Girls, signed into law in 1972. Title IOX of the Education Amendments prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in any educational program or activity receiving federal funding, a broad legal requirement that would reshape American schools and universities throughout the decade and beyond. While the law addressed discrimination across all areas of education, its most visible and widely remembered impact came in school and college athletics, where participation by girls and young women expanded dramatically over the following years as schools were required to provide equitable athletic opportunities. Before Title IX, organized schools, sports for girls were often minimal, underfunded, or entirely absent in many American schools, reflecting a long-standing assumption that competitive athletics were primarily a male. The law did not transform this landscape overnight. Schools were given time to comply, and enforcement varied considerably by region and by the resources and willingness of individual school districts. But by the end of the 1970s, girls' participation in high school sports across the courts, across the country had increased many times over compared to the start of the decade. A shift that reflected a broader change in expectations about what activities and ambitions were considered appropriate for young women. Title IX's reach extended well beyond athletics, addressing discrimination in academic admissions, financial aid, and treatment within educational institutions more broadly. Its passage reflected the same underlying legal logic seen throughout the decade as other major reforms. That federal law could be used as a direct tool to dismantle sex-based discrimination embedded in American institutions, one specific area of daily life at a time, from the classroom application to the divorce court. Chapter 9: The Rise of the Working Mother. One of the most consequential and sustained shifts of 1970s was the steady rise in the number of American women, and particularly married women with children, participating in the paid workforce. This trend had begun earlier in the 20th century and would continue well beyond the decade's end. But the 1970s marked a period of especially rapid growth, driven by a combination of factors, including rising costs of living, expanding educational attainment among women, and the broader cultural and legal shifts already described in this story. Economic pressure played a significant, often underappreciated role in this shift. The 1970s were marked by significant inflation and economic uncertainty, including the 1970-73 oil crisis and its accompanying recession conditions that made a second household income increasingly necessary for many families to maintain their standard of living, of whether either spouse held strong ideological views about women's proper role. For a great many American families, the entry of wives and mothers into paid work was driven as much by economic necessity as by any explicit feminist conviction, a practical response to a difficult economic decade rather than solely a political statement. This shift created new tensions that the decade's institutions were often slow to address. Affordable, reliable childcare remained difficult to secure for many working mothers throughout the 1970s. With federal efforts to establish comprehensive public childcare programs, including a major bill vetoed by President Nixon 1971, failing to materialize into the kind of a broad public support system found in some other industrialized countries during this period. Many working mothers instead relied on informal arrangements, extended family, or private childcare paid for out of their own new earnings, a patchwork solution that placed considerable strain on women managing both a job and the bulk of household and child care responsibilities that remained throughout the decade disproportionately theirs, even in households where both spouses worked full-time. Chapter 10: Fashion, Fitness, and the Changing Body Image. The way American women dressed and thought about their own bodies shifted noticeably over the course of the 1970s, reflecting broader cultural currents running through the decade. Early in the period, fashion carried over some of the bold experimentation of the late 1960s, with bright colors, bold patterns, and miniskirt remaining popular, while by the middle and later years of the decade, styles shifted toward looser, more natural silhouettes, including the widespread popularity of denim, prairie-style dresses, and the wide-legged pantsuit, which became an increasingly accepted form of professional attire for women for venturing white-collar workplaces in growing numbers. The pantsuit's rise carried real symbolic weight beyond fashion trends alone. Trousers for women in professional and formal settings had faced social resistance in earlier decades, and their broader acceptance throughout the 1970s reflected the same practical push toward workplace equality seen in the decade's legal reforms, a small but visible sign that women's professional presence was becoming an accepted, ordinary fact of American life rather than an exceptional ring special. The decade also saw the beginning of a significant popular fitness movement, with jogging and aerobic exercise gaining mainstream popularity among American women by the later 1970s, encouraged in part by new research on the health benefits of regular exercise and by a cultural shift toward viewing physical fitness as compatible with, rather than opposed to, conventional femininity. This period predates the more elaborate home fitness and exercise video culture that would explode in the following decade. But its roots, including early running clubs and the first widely popular fitness books aimed specifically at women, were firmly established during these years. Chapter 11: Feminism, Organizing, and Its Limits. The organized movement of the 1970s was not a single unified organization, but a loose network of groups, with sometimes overlapping and sometimes conflicting goals. The National Organization for Women, founded in 1966, grew substantially in membership and influence through the decade, focusing much of its energy on legal and legislative reform, including support for equal rights amendment discussed earlier, and continued advocacy on workplace discrimination and reproductive rights. Alongside this more institutional strand of the movement ran a separate, more radical current often described as women's liberation, which grew out of the civil rights and anti-war movements of the previous decade and focused on consciousness-raising groups, direct challenges to cultural assumptions about gender roles and critiques of institutions ranging from marriage to media representation of women. These two strands of activism, sometimes cooperating and sometimes in open tension with each other over strategy and priorities, together made up what contemporaries and later historians would broadly call second-wave feminism. It is important to this story to acknowledge that the organized feminist movement of the 1970s, like most major American social movements, was disproportionately led and shaped by white, middle-class, and college-educated women in its most visible institutions, even as Black women, and then working-class women engaged with many of the same issues, often through their own separate organizations and with priorities shaped by the particular economic and social conditions of their own communities, including concerns about welfare policy, workplace conditions in lower-wage jobs, and the intersection of racial and gender discrimination that the mainstream movement did not always fully address. Understanding the 1970s accurately requires holding both realities together. A decade of genuine, significant legal and cultural progress for American women broadly, and a decade in which that progress was neither evenly distributed nor uniformly experienced across lines of race and class. Chapter 12: Television, Media, and a New Kind of Woman on Screen. American popular culture in the 1970s began, gradually and unevenly, to reflect some of the real changes taking place in women's lives, offering audiences new kinds of female characters that would have been far less common on American television a decade earlier. The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which premiered in 1970, centered on an unmarried, professionally ambitious woman and building a career in television news, a departure from the housewife-centered sitcoms that had dominated earlier decades. And the show became both a critical and commercial success that helped establish the single, career-focused woman as a viable and popular subject for mainstream entertainment. Other programs of the decade continued to explore this shifting territory with varying degrees of nuance. Maude, a spin-off of All in the Family that debuted in 1972, tackled subjects including divorce, menopause, and, in a widely discussed episode, abortion, directly engaging with the era's most contested social debates in a way earlier television comedy had rarely attempted. These shows did not represent the totality of 1970s television, which continued to broadcast plenty of programming reflecting more traditional depictions of women's roles. but women's roles. But their presence and popularity marked a real shift in what American audiences were willing to watch and discuss in their own living rooms. Print media followed a similar, uneven pattern of change. Ms. Magazine, zine, launched in 1972 by journalist Gloria Steinem and a group of collaborators, offered an explicitly feminist alternative to the more traditional homemaking and beauty-focused women's magazines that had long dominated newsstands, quickly becoming an influential, if not universally read, voice within the broader media landscape available to American women during the decade. Together, these shifts in television and print did not single-handedly change how American women lived, but they reflected, amplified, and in some cases accelerated conversations about women's roles that were already unfolding across kitchens, workplaces, and courtrooms throughout the country. Chapter 13, The Decade's Uneven, Lasting Legacy. By the end of the 1970s, the legal and economic landscape for American women looked substantially different than it had at the decade's start. Credit could be established independently. Divorce, while still difficult and often financially precarious, no longer required proving fault in court in most states. Job advertisements could no longer be legally divided by gender. Girls in growing numbers were playing organized school sports for the first time in American history. Reliable contraception. Following Roe v. Wade, legal abortion had become part of the medical and legal landscape women navigated when making decisions about their own bodies and futures. None of these changes arrived without conflict, and none of them settled the underlying questions permanently. The Equal Rights Amendment's failure to achieve ratification stood as a visible reminder that American women themselves remained divided over exactly what legal equality should require and what it might risk. The persistent gap in pay between men and women doing comparable work, the ongoing lack of comprehensive public childcare, and the continued concentration of household labor on women, even as they entered the paid workforce in record numbers, all remained largely unresolved as the decade closed. Issues that would carry forward into the following decades of American life. What the 1970s ultimately offered was not a finished transformation, but a foundation built through specific court cases, specific pieces of legislation, and the accumulated daily choices of millions of individual women navigating a rapidly shifting set of rules about what their lives could look like. A woman born in 1950, entering adulthood right as the decade began, and a woman born in 1960, coming of age just as it ended, inherited genuinely different sets of legal rights, economic opportunities, and cultural expectations, separated by only 10 years, but by an extraordinary amount of quiet. hard-won change. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment